Guyana, and welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. I am Malika Ramsey. Thank you very much for joining us. With me is Brigadier the Honorable David Granger, Opposition Leader and Leader of the People's National Congress Reform. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mike.
Guyana is one of the many third world countries that continue to face several social issues. Now today we focus on poverty. Our main focus is poverty today, of course. Some may say it's high, and government may say that they've done a lot to reduce the incidence of poverty in Guyana. But today we get the opposition leader's take on it. Mr. Granger, the first thing I want to focus on really is people who are employed but are still poor. Why is that? Because you would think that you're gainfully employed, you have a job, you can to some extent afford to put food on the table, to feed your children, to feed yourselves. Why are people who are employed still poor?
Poverty has many causes. Unemployment is one factor, but some people are underemployed. For most of the year, they don't have steady jobs, or the jobs are poorly paid, or the families are too large. And instead of being sufficient maybe for a husband, wife, or they might have other dependents. So these are some of the factors which could affect employed persons, that the salary just, the wages are just too low, and they can't stretch the wages. And of course there are other factors which can influence poverty. For example, they may have high medical bills, they may have high utility bills. So at the end of the month, at the end of the day, there just isn't enough money to go around, and they remain poor. And sometimes this gives rise to what I call hereditary poverty. Because they are poor, they can't provide the facilities and resources for their own children to go to school. For example, transportation, books, school uniforms, and food. And as a result of that, the children's education could be impaired. So the parents are poor and the children are poor, and maybe the children are forced to drop out, to leave school early, their education is incomplete, and they have to take a low-paying job, and the cycle goes on. Their children too suffer just as they have suffered it before them.
I'm happy that you mentioned the cycle, but I'm going to come to that a little later on. We spoke there about people who are employed. In your experience, and of course we know you do a lot of research, and in your research, if that is the situation for the people who are employed, what would you say for the people who are unemployed, as it relates to the number of persons that you may have experienced who are unemployed and really, really poor?
But the situation is quite grim, because the economy of Guyana, although there has been some indication of growth in the overall gross national product, actually the distribution of the income, or the national income, is quite uneven, and there's a widening gap between the very rich and the very poor. So that is another problem, that although the economy has been growing, it's what we call jobless growth. There have not been more jobs, more employment. Mm-hmm. And there's what we call structural unemployment. That is to say that there are no new industries, there are no new opportunities for employment. There are no new farms being opened. Their manufacturing is stagnant. So structurally, there's nothing for them to do, because no new jobs are being created in the entire economic system. Although a few people can get rich, that wealth is not filtering down or percolating through the system.
Okay, all right. You spoke about wealth and maybe new industries and new entities, and I've read somewhere that one of the ways that you can probably reduce the poverty level is by opening up your country, your nation, to privatization, encouraging persons to come and invest. My question really is, though, when you do that, is there not a danger of probably your nation and its people losing some of their identity?
I don't think it's an identity question, it's an economic question, and privatization has been tried. It is successful in part, and I have given a commitment from the earliest days of my campaign that some of the remaining state industries should be in private hands. For example, I don't think that the state should be running television or newspapers, except for public broadcasting purposes. It shouldn't be on a commercial basis. And the state would have to get out some loss-making enterprises. But I feel that private enterprise, alongside other forms of foreign direct investment, should be able to restart or to jumpstart some of the industries in the economy. It is not happening now in Guyana, largely because of the security situation, except for gold and diamond mining, which has attracted people from different nationalities, particularly from Brazil. I think there might be some Chinese and Russians in timber and mineral business. There is not much foreign direct investment in the manufacturing sector. As a result of that, there are no new jobs being created because the jobs in mining are quite few, and in timber, these are traditional areas of employment, so no new jobs are being created there. What we need to do is look for opportunities for economic growth, which also create opportunities for employment, and that has been happening over the last 2 decades or so.
All right, let me bring this back to the people of themselves. It has also been somewhat proven in Guyana that poverty exists mainly between our rural citizens, and we can also at the same time come to the interior locations whereby it is also said that the Amerindians, our Amerindian brothers and sisters, are, in terms as it relates to the ethnic groups, are the poorest. In your estimation, is that true, and why?
Well, the national average, I think, is about 39% of the national poverty level, as given by UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, is about 39 to 40%. Countrywide, the indigenous communities, particularly in the Barima-Waini, Koyuni-Mazruni, Pataro-Separoni, and Rupununi regions, those 4 regions, the poverty level is about 75%. Now, poverty is related directly to 2 factors. One is education, the second is employment. Once the education of the population is low, that is, you have poor facilities, you have insufficient teachers, and there's a high dropout rate, there's a high literacy rate, you are going to find problems because there will not be sufficient jobs for persons with poor education. And these are jobs for laborers, and I think people are looking for better educated people who can be employed. So that is a problem. And again, we come back to the employment problem. We have not been creating new jobs, and as a result of that, many people in the hinterland, where the extractive industries are located, particularly gold and diamond mining and timber, these new occupations have not provided employment for the people who live in the hinterland, particularly indigenous people. You get jobs still as boatmen and maybe divers or cutters of wood and that type of thing, but they're not jobs that require a high level of education. People have not been able to create positions in engineering and sciences and so on, advanced farming. For example, there are no new highways in the hinterland, there's no new bridge building. So the lack of development has had an impact on employment, and also the low level of education has had an impact on employment as well. Many of the indigenous people, of course, go to school in the hinterland, and there are about, by my calculation, I think there are about 2,500 students in these schools. But they're all plagued with overcrowding, sometimes inadequate number of teachers, sometimes they have other logistical problems. For example, they run out of food. There have been some cases of food shortages in some of these places. So the hinterland areas have suffered heavily because of the education deficiencies and also because of the lack of economic development. Many of them are forced to go back to traditional agriculture, which is subsistence level. And as a result of that, many of them migrate, they just go over the border to Brazil, where they're employed in menial positions. So we're losing our young people to neighboring countries, and in the case of the hinterland, mostly to Brazil and to some extent to Venezuela, because we cannot provide economic opportunities for them.
All right, let me bring it back closer to the rural areas, not as far as interior locations. Again, the rural communities, they have been identified as some of the poorest communities in our country. How can I, as a person living in a rural area, how can I, because at the end of the day, you wait on the politicians to do everything, you may end up not having anything, but how can I, living in a rural area, rural community, do something or begin to do something to reduce the poverty level in my community?
Well, first of all, it goes back to education. The type of education that you pursue is important, because some people look forward to joining the army or the police force or the civil service. Well, I don't think that is a good idea nowadays. They need to think of private entrepreneurship. They need to think of going into business, and it means that your education must be oriented towards self-employment. Secondly, the rural areas are most suited to agro-processing. This means that young people coming out of schools who wish to find employment must think about agro-processing. They must think about, planting up orchards with guavas and mangoes and cherries and other tropical fruit. They must think of processing these fruit, making jams and jellies and juices, and packaging them and exporting them to other countries, or even selling them to supermarkets. So the type of education that young people get, business education, and the type of credit to which they have access, microcredit, for example, they should be able to borrow $1 million or $2 million, which is not a lot of money nowadays, in order to buy some simple equipment. Somebody might want to open a photo studio, a beauty salon, and they must be able to borrow money to set themselves up rather than just staying at home doing nothing. Maybe a sewing machine. People can make uniforms and sell to students at schools.
Okay.
So this is the type of activity which could be done in rural areas or urban areas as well. But in particular, rural areas have the benefit of having access to arable land, and they should be able to go into some small-time, crop farming, making, growing peppers, making pepper sauce. That is the type of thing which Partnership for National Unity would support for young people, throughout the country, but particularly in the rural areas.
Okay, I want to talk about homeless people a bit. I know this is probably going into another area of social issues, but the fact is most of them are homeless because they're poor. And I just want to touch on housing a bit. A few years back, I would have heard sentiments from people saying that one of the problems they were facing as it relates to housing is that you go into the ministry and you're told that persons with maybe a husband and children, they're getting preference, while you, a single person now coming up, would have to wait. Question, I'd love your intake on this. Isn't that in a sense promoting poverty? Because what you're saying is that you're sending me to go have a family before I can get a house. Because there are actually people who want to do it stage by stage. You get the house and then you look after the family.
I don't know if there's a direct correlation between that situation and poverty, but certainly I would recommend that people try to create a sound economic base, have good employment before they get married and before they seek housing. Maybe it's a cart and horse situation, but I think if a person goes to school and gets a good education, graduates and gets a good job, I think he or she will be in a better position to secure housing after that. Mm-hmm. And I think that would be a good justification, but I don't think that's a direct cause of poverty. Sometimes people who are not ambitious, or people who dropped out of school for one reason or the other, do not have the opportunity to re-engage the education sector or the formal education system. And that is why some years ago, when our party was in government, we had created something called the Guyana Youth Corps. And the Guyana after that, the Guyana National Service as the successor to the Youth Corps. But the whole idea was that people who had dropped out of the education system should be able to re-engage the system, become qualified, get a good job, or become self-employed, and that would, ease some of the problems they face when they seek housing or when they seek to raise a family. But if they do it the other way around, you're bound to run into problems.
Okay. I want to deal specifically now with the government, and I am going to just read the first 3 lines of a July 18, 2003 article as related to government. Of course, the heading was 5.7 billion poverty reduction program to commence in 2003. Government has several programs geared at further reducing poverty in Guyana. These programs will cost a total of 5.7 billion. The money will be utilized over a 5-year period for community-based projects. In your estimation, sir, how successful has government been regarding that? Because that is 10 years ago, that was 2003.
Well, the government has failed to reduce poverty significantly. I'm aware of some of the initiatives, but they're obviously following a wrong model. There are several schemes. Well, we are aware of the Social Impact Amelioration Program, CIMAP, and there are, Basic Needs Trust Fund, there are rural programs, and there are some smaller programs like Women of Work, WW. So I'm sure there must be about a dozen programs, but these are patchwork. These are cures for maybe small or individual problems. The poverty problem, as I pointed out at the early part of this program, is huge. We're talking about 40% of the population which is poor. And these little plasters have not been adequate. They are necessary perhaps, but they're not sufficient to bring about a significant turnaround in the poverty situation. What the government needs to do is pay more attention to the education system. It is no point trying to put a plaster on the sores. What I'm recommending is preventing the sore in the first place, and you can only do that by having sufficient people graduate fully qualified, not necessarily to get a job in the civil service, but to become a self-employed person, to go into business. And we need to tackle the education problem first. And secondly is the employment problem. This means that the economy must be allowed to grow. And it can only grow if you develop a manufacturing sector, if you develop sectors which allow educated people to maybe build bridges, build roads, develop the hinterland, go into farms, and that sort of thing. That is what is going to provide employment. Not the little programs that the government is running, not the CIMAP under Basic Need Trust Fund, but you need to get people off of that. That is almost a version of relief. You need to get people off of relief and into mainstream economy. You cannot develop a country with CIMAP. You can only develop it with a sound education system and a sound economy. And CIMAP, is a plaster. It is not healing the problems that the country faces.
Okay, this question may, in a sense, take you back to something that you would have already said, but at the end of the day, there are very poor people, and these very poor people, they watch the news, they listen to David Granger, they listen to Donald Ramatar, and they hear things like economy growth, the economy is booming. At the end of the day, it's not trickling down to them. So as Guyana currently stands, what does especially if they hear it in the 2013 budget, what does the statement like, especially coming from the finance minister, that we've had economic growth in the past year, what does it mean for the very poor people of this nation, or what should it mean?
It normally means that the macroeconomic indicators are intact. You need that because this deals with the economy, it deals with exports, it deals with the overall stability of currency. So you need macroeconomic stability for the country to be regarded as a stable place, for a stable destination for tourism, for investment, for everything. But in addition to that, at the micro level, at the household level, you also need to have proper, education and jobs. It is down at the household level that the poverty is really felt, because at the macroeconomic level, big businessmen, might be producing goods, they might be importing, they might be selling, and they might be very rich in the country. For example, there's a gold rush on, and obviously the country is profiting or benefiting from increased sales of gold. Those that are legitimate, of course, those sales that are legitimate. Similarly, if there is a boom in sugar sales, if sugar prices are high, the government, the country can sell sugar in the world market. But this does not necessarily translate into higher wages for workers, or to better education, or to greater employment. It only means that the people who are already employed in sugar, already employed in gold mining, might enjoy, maybe better conditions. But people who are unemployed will remain unemployed. The economy has got to grow, and what is happening is that we have had jobless growth. We've had, if for example you produce gold at $1,300 an ounce, and then gold prices go to $1,600 an ounce, it doesn't mean you employ more people. It means the unemployed will remain unemployed. But what the minister is speaking about is that the macroeconomic indicators are intact or have been improving. But he also means, or he didn't say that, is that at the micro level, at the household level, we have not had more employment, and I think that is where people feel it most.
But why not be honest with the public? I mean, I probably ask.
It's not necessarily dishonest. It's not necessarily dishonest. It is just maybe half of the truth.
Okay, but so then there is a fear, there is a danger in telling the population the rest of the story. Is it?
Well, if he's talking about poverty, if he's talking about unemployment, I think he'll be obliged to admit that poverty has not been reduced over the last 20 years in any significant degree. And the Prime Minister himself opened a review of the poverty reduction strategy of the government, I think a few years ago, and he admitted that the figures do not indicate that there has been much success in removing or eradicating poverty. Guyanese do not need to be as poor as they are, and we can see poverty everywhere. You can go out into the central business district, you see beggars, you see street children, you see destitute and homeless people. In fact, the government admits that there is a problem, because they're the ones who create these drop-in centers for street children. They're the ones who create these night shelters for homeless people. So you can only do these things if you know that there are a lot of homeless people and there are a lot of street children. So it is an admission that the poverty reduction strategy has not been working in terms of its impact on alleviating or eradicating poverty.
Okay. A recent census was done. Most of the population, we're not sure if that was completed. Of course, I'm not asking you along that lines, but how would that census, in a sense, help government to, as it relates to statistics, to fight poverty?
Well, it should be a guide to government policy. It should be a guide to governance, because one would assume that it's the government's task to eradicate poverty and to make sure the citizens have a good life. And as a result of that, they should be able to devise policies which determine whether there needs to be more emphasis on social services, on social protection, on education, and that sort of thing. So it is the best indicator, because the census is basically an aspect of demography. That is the study of people, the study of populations. So that is the best means of guiding policy, because why are we here? We're here to have a good life, and we're not just here to build buildings. We're here to ensure that people don't suffer. And as long as there's poverty, it means that people are suffering. And worse still, I think among the people who are suffering, the young people, street children and jobless young people leaving schools, they suffer the most.
How would David Granger, the opposition, and a partnership for national unity, and I know this is going to take some time, fight or try to reduce poverty? And then the question also comes again, because we hear about consultation and working along with government. Are you prepared, aside from how would you fight poverty on your own, if whenever the next election APN used to go into government, how would you fight it? And if not, are you prepared to work, or I should say, at what level are you prepared to work along with government to see poverty in Guyana reduced?
Two main instruments in the hands of the government are the education system. And over again I've spoken about the large number of dropouts and the poor facilities at some of our schools. But the education system has got to be rectified if we are to go to deal with this problem of poverty. Most of the poverty problems we find in this country are caused by poor education. And as I said earlier, the young people leaving school suffer the most. The second problem, of course, is economic, and the economy has got to grow away from the traditional sectors. All of us have grown up here with gold and diamond mining, timber extraction, sugar and rice production, bauxite, and we have not really moved far off of that base over the last 20 years or so. What we need to do is create new industries, and we need to develop manufacturing, and unless we do that, we will not be able to provide new opportunities for employment. So Partnership for National Unity in government is going to pay more attention, first of all, to education, and secondly, to allowing the economy to grow so that we develop new industries which could provide more employment for our people.
Currently, though, in its current stage, how much contribution, or how much are you willing to work along with government for a reduction, if they're to put a proposal on the table and say, this is what we plan?
Well, the government has been very reluctant to sit down with a Partnership for National Unity to discuss the budget or discuss economic issues. And what I would do is tell them exactly what I just told you. We got to fix the education system. I can tell them how it could be done. And we have to create an environment in which manufacturing could take place. In this country right now, it's based largely on the poor security, and people are reluctant to invest their hard-earned money in a country which is not safe. They prefer to put their money in places like Barbados or the Bahamas, But in Guyana, life is very unsafe. Only this week, the People's National Congress nearly lost the General Secretary because of an attack in his own home. And if this could happen to the General Secretary of the People's National Congress, people must be saying, well, why should I bring my investment into this country if the government cannot protect its own citizens? So we need to create a safe society. We need to attract investment if we're going to allow the economy to grow. We need to rectify the education system. Okay.
Finally, on this edition, sir, we're all waiting on the 2013 budget. Again, I may be asking you to look into a crystal ball here, but are you expecting the 2013 budget to have anything in it that will eventually, by the end of this year at least, trickle down to the very poor people of our nation?
Well, we've only had one engagement with the government on the budget, that is between Dr. Ashley Singh and Mr. Carl Granger, who is our Shadow Minister for Economic Affairs. And we do not see as yet any indication that the government has understood the nature of the poverty problem in Guyana, and that is prepared to put in place any measures that will seriously tackle poverty, that will alleviate or even eradicate poverty. We don't see that happening. I don't have much hope for this unilateral budget that the PPP is trying to impose on us.
Okay. Brigadier the Honorable Opposition Leader, Mr. David Granger, thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much to you, Guyana, for tuning in to another program of The Public Interest. Until next time, I am Malika Ramsey.